Hi everyone, it's a great pleasure to be speaking to you all today from the virtual stage again this year. I'll be introducing you to the top 10 trends of influence for 22-23, and for Trend Hub subscribers, pointing you to the granular supporting detail that you'll be able to access from today on the Trend Hub platform. Well, as we emerge, and as we are emerging from the coronavirus pandemic, we do so into an uncertain world dominated by big topics, by climate change, concern about the global food chain and the sustainability of our food system, challenging economic and trading environments, rising costs for consumers, increasing regulation, and the acceleration of check. There's much more change to come. So from last year's global driver of owning the reset, so we head into a period of conscious control. Amelia will be speaking more to this and discussing it in more detail following this presentation, but suffice to say that as we begin to understand the extent of the need to treat the planet and the people on it with more respect, we're increasingly accepting a greater societal and personal control. Previously, we've welcomed individual freedoms to choose and to do, to be who and what we want to be. However, the continued evidence that this is creating an ever more unfair and unstable society. And it's changing the belief that the structures of the state should combine to play a greater role in reining in the excesses of those who refuse to recognize that change is required to make life palatable for the human race as a whole. So as always, we've taken many thousands of hours of research to date, combined that with our understanding of how society and consumers behave in such times, and together with our industry experience, our understanding of gastronomy and the human sciences, to develop the 22-23 sense-making foresight framework. The 22-23 trends framework is made up of one global driver, 4 social and cultural forces, 11 food and beverage megatrends, and over 60 trend manifestations. If you're a Trend Hub subscriber, you'll be able to explore in granular detail the intricacies of the framework that are brought to life in more detail than ever before, with supporting videos and other platform-based assets spanning social and cultural trends, food and beverage trends, as well as cuisines and ingredients. This framework is designed to make sense of the future horizon and seed future business opportunities that lie within it. What we've done for today is focus on the top 10 influencing trends for 22-23, which are derived from the more granular framework. It's those that are shifting and changing at pace. So the focus for today will be these, the top 10 key trend messages for 22-23. And these have been developed by analysing where these trend manifestations were in 2021, our understanding of the wider societal, cultural and political landscape and its likely influence on food and drink over the next couple of years. And what I'm going to do is bring these to life for you in more detail, indicate the speakers that will be talking to these topics in more detail, and for Trend Hub subscribers, pointing you to the supporting resources on the platform where you can explore these in much more detail. But to provide you with a short introduction, here's the top 10 in film.
Top 10 New and Rising 2022. Carbon truths. Carbon miles are the new calories, and consumers want to eat less. Climate-friendly diets gain traction, centered on foods with the smallest carbon footprint. Businesses will respond with more transparency regarding emissions, contributing to an increase in carbon labeling, despite the fact that carbon along the supply chain is difficult to measure. And it's not just about carbon reduction or being carbon neutral. Now the goals are carbon negative or active. Lab to fork. Cultivated protein, aka cell-based or lab-grown, is the next frontier in motherless meat. There's fast-paced development in both cellular, using animal cells, and acellular, i.e. plant-based, processes. Regulatory hurdles are jumped and price points lowered, leading proponents to say it's finally commercially viable at scale. And there's opportunity to explore beyond meat. Companies are using processes like precision fermentation to make lab-grown milk, honey, cheese, chocolate, and more. Sea farms. Sea plants are being hailed as a potential sustainable food solution with the ability to replace fish, grains, meat, and even plastic. Seaweed, dulse, kelp, and samphire appear on more and more menus, from QSR to fine dining. Microalgae is meanwhile used to make anything from milk to burger patties. And chefs and marine scientists alike are getting excited about Zostera marina, a seagrass being harvested for its grains and lauded as the rice of the sea and the next big superfood. Seamless order and delivery. Contactless and friction-free experiences are hot property in food services. Digital kiosks, voice recognition, and cameras are enabled to make the ordering process quick and seamless. Meanwhile, cashierless checkouts, lockers, vending machines, drive-through, and curbside collection make picking up orders easier than ever. Robots are used more widely to do everything from meal prep to delivery. And speaking of delivery, disruption continues at pace, from apps that promise delivery in minutes to drone delivery or precision drop-offs with the help of geolocation tools. Same but healthier. The backlash against ultra-processed and HFSS, i.e. high-fat, salt, sugar foods, continues to grow, but consumers still want to enjoy their favourite foods. Cue a surge in innovation around better-for-you alternatives. Brands look to natural sweeteners and sugar alternatives like allulose to reduce the glycemic impact of products. They also turn to the likes of swap-outs, such as grain-free flour and salt substitutes, and they drive to get as close to clean label as possible, so products that are perceived as highly processed are reformulated with fewer, all-natural ingredients. Little ones. Childhood obesity is a crisis, and most agree too much of kids' caloric intake comes from ultra-processed foods high in fat, salt or sugar. So parents scrutinise labels and brands that are reformulating kids' products to make them healthier, with targeted nutrition for toddlers to teenagers. That means all natural ingredients, hidden veggies, vitamin boosters, and cutting down on the fat, salt and sugar content of traditional favourites. And there's a growth in convenient, healthy solutions for kids, from clean energy drinks to better-for-you ready meals. Fine eating, not dining. For many diners, the future lies in fine eating rather than fine dining, i.e. focus on the food, without the formality. This gastronomy-forward, fuss-free approach is driving a resurgence in French-style bistros and brasseries, gourmet wine bars, and the new generation of gastropubs. Same Michelin-grade food as any leading restaurant, but in a more relaxed setting. You can even slip your shoes off. Look east. The cultural influence of East Asia is growing at pace. Consumers can't get enough of the food, fashion, film and music of Korea and Japan in particular. Japanese food, already well loved globally, is explored further, and cooks get creative with cuisine mashups, e.g. Japanese Italian, pantry staples and sweet formats. Mochi donut, anyone? Meanwhile, K-culture sweeps the world. Indeed, 26 Korean words have been added to the Oxford English Dictionary. The K-craze draws consumers to Korean dishes like tteokbokki, bulgogi, fried chicken, and Korean corn dogs. Sensory exploration. The pandemic created a newfound appreciation for our senses, not least because loss of taste and smell are well-documented COVID side effects. So now dishes are elevated with big and bold flavours. Sour, salt, spicy and umami. Look out too for kokumi, the savoury sensation described as the next umami. Brands also play with the sense of smell, using scents to transport us to happy places. And let's not forget the sense of touch. After being deprived of physical interaction for so long, we want to use our hands and play with our food. Novel nostalgia. Sometimes we need to forget the world's stresses just for a moment and feel like we're kids again. Brands step up to the plate with whimsical concepts and nostalgic experiences. Arcade games, glow-in-the-dark designs, ice cream trucks, and so on. And consumers seek out childhood favourites like s'mores, hot dogs, custard, jelly and ice cream floats. But this time around with a gourmet and grown-up makeover. Think CBD-infused trifle, boozy slushies, and homemade Pop-Tarts. Because indulging your inner child doesn't mean ignoring your gourmand side.
So first up, I'd like to start with Carbon Truths, and it sits as part of the megatrend Mind Your Step and is underpinned by the social driver Green Life. Our current food system is in many ways as amazing as it is enormous, and it feeds a great majority of the world's population and supports the livelihoods of over 1 billion people. But around 30% of total greenhouse gas emissions are attributable to our food system. So how we produce and what and how we eat is a significant influencer on climate change. And to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees and reach net zero by 2050, we'll have to transform things like land use, reduce waste, and cut consumption of some of the most carbon intensive foods, which will require a complete rethink of our food system. Aside from this monumental task, how do we make that positive choice as consumers? Many different facets of the food trends that are associated with climate crisis are covered in detail in the 22-23 trends framework. But Carbon Truths is about exactly that and is just one of those trends. How do we make that positive choice? Fiona Howie from Foundation Earth will be speaking in more detail about this topic as part of today's summit, as will Matthew Glover from Veganuary and Veg Capital. Consumers are increasingly concerned. They are increasingly valuing foods and associated practices that are anti-destructive. This isn't a niche discussion, it's very much front of the consumer psyche. We believe that increasingly consumers will look to account for their own personal impact on the environment. But how do you do that? Consumers are demanding more information. They say continually what they need to make positive choice is information. And if that information is as important as it is, consumers need to be able to make a positive choice and be empowered to make comparisons between products and services, particularly if they're going to be more expensive, which they may well be. And that's the essence of carbon truths, the requirement for the visibility of carbon environmental labelling and then seeking out better choices. It is at the moment in its infancy, but you can see from this example here from the Just Salad carbon labelling with their carbon counter. So how do we expect this to manifest? Well, front of pack and on menu carbon labelling to become the norm, and the development and the unification of the science to support this. The examples on the right bring to life how this is starting to look, examples from Food Steps and from Foundation Earth. One of the challenges is that life cycle assessment is time consuming and expensive, and we expect significant steps forward in tech-enabled life cycle assessment, making it more accessible for more businesses and brands to put that information on packs and on menus in much the same way that you would in preparing nutritional information to go on pack. This in turn will drive a new wave of climate-led product innovation, where food and drink brands design out the elements contributing to climate emergency. That will shift supply side and upstream environmental practices to be part of the consumer lexicon, such as regenerative agriculture, and expect to see issues like waste, byproduct and upcycled, which has a new certification in the US, incidentally, to be talked about front and center of product propositions, as well as practices like refill and return and local. We expect the continued momentum behind movements such as climatarian, so choosing to eat according to what is least harmful to the environment, and reducitarian, the mindful reduction of animal-based products for climate benefit. You may have seen the recent documentary on Netflix on reducitarian, both of which will be empowered by the ability to make a positive choice. In turn, we also expect the conversation to shift from reduced carbon to carbon negative or carbon active. Next up, I want to talk about Lab to Fork, that sits as part of the mega trend future saviors and is underpinned by the social driver, again, green life. We're increasingly aware of the impact that our growing appetite for meat consumption has on the environment due to land use and emissions, feed. And there are many ways that this is being addressed by consumers, such as the increased consumption of plant-based foods, in agriculture with innovation in animal feeds, increasing adoption of practices like regenerative agriculture. But Lab to Fork is all about satisfying our desire for meat without the need for animals and slaughter. In this context, technology is creating new realities where the idea of eating something that you may think of as being unnatural is increasingly being recoded and positive in light of the environmental emergency and growing ethical awareness. This is something that we have highlighted in previous foresight releases, but the progress and pace is now gathering increased momentum, which is why we're calling it out in the top 10. The possibility of creating meat in a laboratory is moving ever closer, despite the challenges, which of course are numerous: consumer acceptance, cost, and of course regulatory approval. To date, only one lab-grown meat has received permission to be served to the public: chicken bites produced by the US company Eat Just, which were approved in Singapore in December 20. Eat Just has shown that whilst these factors are difficult, they're not impossible to overcome through its operations in Singapore. The technology receives the development of support by some governments, particularly in Singapore and in Israel, combining this with US-led tech. This is driving a new pace of development. Over 70 companies globally poured 1.2 billion of investment into this area in 2020 and 900 million to date in 2021. So it's key for us to consider what could this disrupt mean for our businesses and brands and consumer attitudes to animal and plant-based foods alike. And Brian Spears from New Age Meats will be speaking more to this trend as part of today's summit. So how do we expect this to manifest? I'm not going to make this into a science lesson, but it's not desperately straightforward. There are a number of different strands to this. In very simple terms, we have cellular agriculture, which grows cells that originated in or from an animal, that are fed with nutrients, and they grow and multiply to become tissue, which can be produced and processed into the meats that we all know. In 22-23, we expect further scaling of the technologies and more regulatory approval in this space. Off the back of this, there is the potential for hybrid products that combine plant-based and cultured ingredients to deliver truly on taste. An example might be adding cultured fat to a plant-based chicken nugget that could provide a genuine taste of chicken, as well as improving the juiciness and meatiness whilst having that authentic texture thanks to the plant-based proteins. Then you have acellular agriculture, where microorganisms such as yeast and bacteria, rather than animal cell cultures, are used in precision fermentation to produce products such as milk and dairy white proteins. Some products have already been commercialized in this area, such as Greta's ice cream, which uses Perfect Day's flora-based dairy proteins to make dairy ice cream, but not from animals. And these technologies, if regulatory approved, have the potential to disrupt how we consider and what we consider as being meat. And there are a plethora of lab-grown everyday products and foodstuffs just waiting in the wings, including things like honey and coffee and chocolate, to name a few. Next up, I'd like to talk about sea farms, and this sits as part of the mega trend future saviours and is also underpinned by the social driver green life. This one is still in its infancy, but as we look to support our food systems with alternative, healthy and sustainable food sources, some progressive businesses and chefs look beyond fish and seafood at what the oceans can offer. Sea plants, weeds, grains and vegetables are being hailed as healthy protein, as well as being nutrient dense and rich in antioxidants. Seaweeds grown using zero input ocean regenerative agriculture potentially have the ability to absorb excess carbon that causes the acidification of oceans. Eating seaweeds are an intrinsic part of some food cultures, but one of the really interesting areas is that of sea grains. Now, gastronomes and environmentalists alike are focusing their attention on a vital element of the underwater ecosystem, which might just be the next big superfood and also play a vital role in marine conservation. This is where we cue Zisteria marina, also known as eelgrass, a species of seagrass which grows on the coastlines around the world. Seagrasses are said to be one of the most efficient carbon sinks on the planet, which is why they're often called the lungs of the sea. And this is where Chef Angel Leon comes in. Leon and his team were researching the potential plants and vegetables from the ocean floor, and he realized that these swaying meadows were Zisteria marina, and his attention was immediately focused not on the blades of the grass, the eel grasses themselves, but the clusters of small grains that they contain. And Leon launched a project to study the plant in more detail. Their focus was to understand, of course, the ideal growing conditions for eelgrass, the water temperature, depth, salinity, sunlight, with a view to widening its cultivation. But of course, Leon was also focused on the potential culinary use of those marine grains. After about 18 months, they were able to collect about 50 kilos of these grains to run some culinary trials and experiments. And you can see that on the top right-hand side of the slide. According to their research, they classified eelgrass and the grains that it contains somewhere between a rice and other legumes. And it's led some to nickname the eelgrass grains as the rice of the sea. They're thought to be more nutritionally dense. In a comparative study, they found that these marine grains have more protein, also contain vitamin A and E, and are a good source of B vitamins and essential fatty acids. How do they taste and cook was obviously one of the key questions. Texture-wise, they're dense and firm like pasta perhaps, or rice that's cooked al dente. Flavor-wise, they're aromatic, plant-based and ionized. Characteristics for culinary use include boiling, like you would a rice or a pasta, or processing it into flour to make breads or dried pastas. So keep an eye on this one for the future. Back in the today, tomorrow space, we see more kelp, dulse and duckweed being used as an ingredient for its unique sensory experience and flavor delivery in culinary applications such as ocean-based charcuterie based on seaweed. A fabulous looking mortadella from Chef Vaughan Maybe in New Zealand is a great example of that. Also we see increasingly being used in rices, in pastas, snacks, drinks and smoothies, as well increasingly raw or cooked in salads and side of plate. We're also seeing an increased application of seaweed as a seasoning, either directly as a part of a salt blend or as a blend such as Japanese furikake as an example. Next up, I'd like to talk about seamless order and delivery that sits as part of the mega trend easy access and is underpinned by the social driver of food democracy. The pandemic has speeded up the adoption by consumers of digital technologies by many years, almost a quantum leap. And this is evidenced by the monumental growth of online grocery shopping, direct-to-consumer offerings, and delivered hot-to-consume food. As a result, consumers are already developing a new baseline when it comes to how food and drink is ordered, prepared and delivered, and the level of friction associated with these interactions. Tech has been an ever-increasing presence in our lives, but a Rubicon very much has been crossed because we as individuals are increasingly prepared to put our lives entirely in machines' hands, empowering our pragmatic lives. So seamless order and delivery is enabled by the very latest in integrated hardware and software technologies. We can see a new era of seamless consumer-facing automation in food and drink. This era is not about gimmick, but about friction-free, contactless order and delivery, robotics, and AI for precision accuracy, speed, and integration. And Peter Schroeder from Karakuri will be speaking more to this trend as part of today's summit. So how do we expect this to manifest? The rollout of Just Walk Out in retail, more trials beyond convenience formats as operating models improve and costs reduce. Amazon's cashierless technology is coming to 2 Whole Foods stores in Washington and Sherman Oaks over the coming weeks and months. We expect even greater cross-platform integration from recipe inspiration through to grocery order and delivery. Our quick convenience commerce will get even faster with Rapid Plus by embracing robotics and automation. Also expect many more partnerships and collaborations in this space. The Gorillas Tesco collaboration is a great example of that. Increasingly, we're seeing robotics play a bigger part in hospitality as the sophistication in precision weighing and handling of food ingredients develops. We've seen acquisitions such as Sweetgreen in the US acquiring the automated restaurant outfit Spice from Boston. Sweetgreen will advance the notion of combining automated components into kitchens that are staffed by humans. Nice Day Chinese American Takeaway in New York City is experimenting with automated wok cookers, and again works alongside kitchen workers that prepare other components. But we've also seen developments which will likely see a shift in the adoption of robotics in the dark kitchen environment. DoorDash signaled this with their acquisition of Chowbotics, the automated salad vending. Out-of-home brands develop hybrid future concepts which adopt automation to create restaurant formats optimized for delivery and collection, not only to homes, but straight into cars, pickup lockers, perhaps even void of dine-in in some cases. Burger King's restaurant of the future signals this. Also on the fringes of this trend, we expect to see more virtual concierge services that combine numerous delivered services, as well as AI-based advanced menu and offer engineering as well. And next up, I want to talk about the same but healthier. This sits as part of the mega trend preemptive health and is underpinned by the social driver Make Me Stronger. As you'd expect, there's a huge amount happening in and around health and wellness. The pandemic has accelerated and amplified interest in and awareness of the role that food and drink plays in our aspiration to live longer, healthier lives. In addition, the National Food Strategy clearly spells out the links between the junk food cycle and human health. Giles Yeo will be speaking more about health and wellness as part of today's summit lineup. Driven by a shift in consumer attitudes, independent study and legislation, we're moving into a new era in health that focuses on proactivity. Healthy eating morphs into eating for health, but crucially without compromise. As consumers continue to educate themselves on the health benefits, functionality, and nutrient density of everyday foods that they love and enjoy. This trend is all about satisfying that need for the same but healthier versions of foods that we all enjoy. So how will it manifest? Well, we expect a continued wave of HFSS motivated challenger innovation, reducing fat, salts and sugars, but beyond that, science and tech-based IP combine to deliver a more responsible indulgence to tackle society's bigger issues. Simply Roasted from the previous slide is a great example of this. The application of IP-based baking technology that combines to deliver without compromise a fried crisp sensory experience, but with 50% less fat than a fried crisp and under 100 calories per pack. Dr. Oetker's Good Baker range and Urban Legends donuts all play into this space. This is very much just the beginning, and it goes way beyond just tweaking formulation around the edges. There is a growing understanding and awareness by consumers that ultra-processed foods may not be as beneficial to maintaining a healthy lifestyle. We expect the growth of this particular space and a growth in the awareness around ultra-processed foods. Ultra-processed foods account for around 56% of the calories that the average person in the UK consumes. And when food has been ultra-processed, studies have shown that the nutrient availability in the small intestine is affected. But these foods are likely to contain more calories per bite, which means that you eat more before you feel full. This is because the plant properties in animal cells have been altered as part of the processing. Issues arise when ultra-processed foods begin replacing unprocessed and minimally processed foods which contain vital nutrients in your diet. They often contain longer ingredient decks and higher in fat, salt and sugar. So we fully expect the conversation around this to grow and gain momentum. A higher degree of transparency and minimal processing in food will only continue as we drive the desire for cleaner foods. The same but healthier food sits alongside 18 other health and wellness orientated trends detailed in our 22-23 trends framework, which if you're a TrendHub subscriber, you can explore further on TrendHub. Next up, I'd like to talk about little ones. And this sits as part of the mega trend on target and is underpinned by the social driver Make Me Stronger. When it comes to health, one size clearly doesn't fit all. We see a continued rise in targeted food nutrition for specific need states and life stages. And one of the big ones that is growing at pace is babies, young children and adolescents. Policymakers and many parents agree that prioritizing childhood obesity and health, as well as the relationship that children and young people have with food, is of paramount importance, and it starts with that first bite. In fact, 7 of the National Food Strategy recommendations revolve around getting good, wholesome, healthy nutrition for children. A staggering 21% of children in year 6, those aged 10 to 11, are obese in academic year 1920. The next generation of kids' food will continue to challenge the junk food cycle with improved availability of quality, HFSS compliant foods and drinks that really meet the needs of children and young people. We know that childhood nutrition can shape healthy outcomes for a lifetime, influencing physical growth, cognitive development, immune maturation, the development of the digestive system, and the development of healthy eating habits. A poor early stage diet raises the risk of developing non-communicable diseases such as asthma and diabetes and obesity and heart disease later in life. But whilst the knowledge is increasing into how food and drink for children affects long-term outcomes, it has remained relatively unserved and is ripe for disruption, particularly for years 3+. So how do you expect this to manifest? There's an awful lot happening in this space, which revolves around a number of key areas. Reaching families at home remains an opportunity with the continued rise of direct-to-consumer kids' food products and services. Mama Made and Little Spoons are great examples of this. Little Spoon builds on a community element around delivered purees and meals, targeting a millennial parent who are increasingly aware of health, well-being and sustainability. In line with the previous trends, it's about ultra-processed foods, cleaner labels, and label transparency. We expect this to grow in this context of food for children and young people. Targeted functional nutrition from toddlers to teenagers with a focus on brain, gut, protein, and immunity. Happy Tot, Super Bellies, fruit and veggie purees on the top right of the screen there are a great example of that, including prebiotic fiber and beta-glucans, which also play into this space. We expect to see a growth in plant-based kids-focused food, which remains a relatively untapped opportunity. Parents are looking for plant-based alternatives for kids' food. Many more parents want to teach their children about eating and cooking responsibly and sustainably, as well as being able to eat the same as the rest of the household, which could well be eating a flexitarian diet. As we see the stagnation of birth rates and even a decline in birth rates in some countries, we expect to see an expansion of ranges that meet the needs of not only babies, but also toddlers, young children and teenagers into the future. Natasha's Law also drives an increased awareness in allergen-friendly early years food. But it's also building on healthy relationships with food at home and at school. And as an example of this, the great work that our charity partner Chefs in Schools do together with others to step change food and the education of food in schools. Next up, I'd like to talk about fine eating and not fine dining. This sits as part of the megatrend New School Rebellion and is underpinned by the social driver food democracy. Post-pandemic, many ask, would that signal the end of fine dining? Of course not. Diners always want to treat, experiment and explore. And of course, there'll always be a place for ultra luxe. But this is an example of a trend accelerated, not created by the pandemic, and one of many within fine dining that we feature in the 22-23 trend predictions. But this trend manifestation reflects an appreciation of realness, of simplicity, accessibility, and of inclusivity. This growing movement is gastronomy forward. It's fuss-free and centered on the food itself. the ingredients to which analog craft techniques are applied, local connections made, ethical stories with a purpose told, and a beauty that comes through relaxed, informal simplicity rather than necessary pomp and ceremony. The picture on the screen is a great example of this. This is hake with cauliflower with a herb and porcini crumb from Prawn on the Lawn in London and also in Padstow, where the focus is on the ingredients, the sourcing, the simple pared back presentation and environment. So how's it manifesting? Well, to start with, it's food forward, often featuring analog techniques. Chef Ross Lusted will be speaking about this later on, such as high and low temperature fire cooking, sourcing as much locally as possible and partnering with producers to deliver seasonally driven food in harmony with nature. Connection with people and place is increasingly important in this context. In terms of the ambience and environment and serveware, it's about relaxed, elemental, home style, fine eating first and restaurant second. We expect to see more fine food in new contexts. For example, food forward wine bars and wine shops. Public Wine Shop in Melbourne and Quality Wines in London are a great example of this. The gastropub plays perfectly into this space and has a renewed relevance in this era where locality and community really resonate. We noted that there were 14 pubs in the 2021 Top 100 Restaurant Awards. And signature dish concepts have a renewed relevance in this space, and many are fine dining casual diffusion concepts. Josh Nyland's Charcoal Fish is his fish and chip shop, where the menu is built around Murray cod, Australia's largest freshwater fish. And of course, employing Josh's zero waste approach to cooking, such as using the fish fat to the application in things like ice cream and also roasting chips and potatoes, and using the bones to make sauces and dressings. Other examples are Melisse's chef, Josiah Kitrin, who plans to open Dirty Chicken based on one of his restaurant's most popular dishes, extra crispy roast chicken. The chicken that will be served in his new restaurant is oven roasted and crusted along the skin, giving even greater texture whilst retaining all of the juiciness. You can see that on the right-hand side of the screen. Next up, I'd like to talk about Look East, that sits as part of the megatrend New School Rebellion and is underpinned by the social drive of food democracy. One of the responses to unpleasant or unstable socio-cultural conditions is the anti-conservative attitude of being more open to experience. Those happy with the status quo are perhaps more closed to new experiences and things, whereas those who seek change score high on openness to new experiences. The pandemic brought about a global attention to Asia, not just China as its source, but the effective and coordinated strategy combined with clear cooperation of their populations and governmental responses of countries such as South Korea and Thailand that has enhanced these countries' reputations as global leaders and opinion formers. Alongside this, Korea has invested 1% of its GDP in developing and exporting their culture globally. Squid Games being the most watched Netflix drama is an example of this. And it's no surprise then that the rebellion is in the air in the world of food, with consumers seeking out something new and refreshing and looking to the East for that influence. Look East takes its lead from Hallyu, which describes the increasing interest in Korean social culture, including food and music, film, fashion, and also cosmetics. As well as South Korea investing in exporting its culture overseas, the pandemic and lockdown has accelerated the wave of interest in the UK and the US, with audiences spending more time on the internet or binge watching streaming services filled with Korean content. But the Look East trend goes beyond influence from South Korea, but instead South Korean leading a wave of wider East Asian influence, in the same way perhaps that we've seen for Southeast Asian. Look East also includes culinary as well as cultural influence from Japan, Taiwan and China. So what are the key elements of Look East when it comes to food? Kicking off with Korean, it's more samjang, which is a Korean dipping sauce. Also tteokbokki, which is a delicious spicy rice cake that can be served steamed or crisp. Also numerous Korean noodle dishes, jamyeong being one, also corn dogs and dalgona, dalgona cookies, dalgona meaning sweet. This all builds on the rise of popularity of dishes such as bibimbap and Korean hot pot, but also ingredients and components such as that we're familiar with, things like kimchi and gochujang. When it comes to Japanese, it's about elevated katsu and fusions with other cuisines. It's things like brothless ramen. We're seeing more omu rice, more onigiri, more vegan ramen, elevated versions of things like okonomiyaki and taiyaki, and seasonings such as sashimi togarashi, furikake, kanzuri, and yuzu kosho. Within Chinese, it's a lot about regionality, particularly Sichuan, Hutong, Shandong, Uyghur, Hunan, which is very much a chili-loving province, and Dongbei in the northeast follows in Sichuan's spicy wake. Also hand-rippled noodles, jambing from the city of Xi'an, which is joined by other Xi'an street food delicacies such as plump steamed dumplings, biang biang noodles, which are fat hand-pulled noodles, rice jelly noodles with chili oil and spinach, and also, not forgetting, lots of Sichuan chili crisp, like in the top example on the top right-hand side of the screen there. And lastly, Taiwan, of course, the bao, which we're seeing a lot of hybriding around the bao, of course, boba, soup dumplings, but also Taiwanese sun-dried ribbon noodles, green onion pancakes, also Taiwanese fried chicken, which is tossed in salt and pepper and basil, and also 5-spice powder. Also fan tuan, a rice-based roll eaten for breakfast. And then, of course, we have the world of Asian mashups, the cuisines of South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and China, meeting American, European, Mexican, and even Middle Eastern influences. The eater recipe on the bottom right-hand side of the screen is a great example of that. Za'atar tteokbokki with a tomato jam, or the brunch broth, butter toast broth, slow roasted tomatoes, smoked pork belly, and a soft egg from Super Ramen, another great example of mashups and fusion in this space. Next up, I wanted to talk about sensory exploration that sits as part of the mega trend Go For It and is underpinned by the social drive of blissful escape. Human behavior is governed by the reward system in the brain, also known as the mesolimbic pathway. Whenever you plan to do something pleasurable, like eating delicious food, dopamine is released, incentivizing to do that thing again. Recent research has found that novel and surprising experiences also release dopamine, therefore novel and surprising food experiences have that doubly powerful effect. Times of deprivation, disease, and war are typically followed by a lust for enjoyable experiences. The Roaring Twenties followed the great trauma in hundreds of years, World War I. And the same can be said for individuals that suffer some kind of trauma. They gain a new lease of life and start to do things that they've always wanted to do, but were reluctant or afraid to. And these two forces are at the root of sensory exploration. The lust for sensory stimulation that was denied or lost in pandemic. It marks a renewed value of the sensory exploration. So sensory exploration takes us from the sensory deprivation of pandemic to a new era defined by a renewed appetite and appreciation for the full sensory stimulation of food experiences that deliver big on touch, smell, and taste and flavor. In particular, those that can be handheld, dipped, those that are complex and intensely flavored or uniquely scented. The example on the screen there is a great one from Loon Croissanterie in Melbourne. Very much serves to this trend. It's a croissant filled with spiced soy sauce, sprinkled with black and white sesame seed. Once it's baked, the pastry is then topped with spring onion, Sichuan pepper mayonnaise, and garnished with a mushroom floss. Christopher and Tom will also be talking about this from Ovant, about sensory experiences in alcohol-free distillations later in today's proceedings. So how is this manifesting? Firstly, chefs are focusing efforts on bigger, bolder, more complex flavors and spicing, combining with a broader elevated focus on all of the senses. A great example of this is a sweet corn kukuri that we had at BB restaurant recently, which is a twist on an Indian corn snack, but the flavor and textural delivery was incredible. The seasoning made of 30 different spices and served with a yellow chili and corn husk mayo, all of the spices being themselves indistinguishable, but leaving you thinking, how did they do that? And Chef Chetan Sharma from BB will be speaking more about this later on. Also in this space, we have flavor bombs across the flavor spectrum, from sour, such as the use of things like Persian lime, preserved lemon, to salty, so salted fruits, salted egg yolk, umami, through ingredients such as koji and dashi. And we can't discuss the drive for big, bold tastes and flavors without mentioning hot and spicy. Increasingly, consumers are looking for more complexity in their heat fix in the guise of global peppers, things like Sichuan pepper, Kampot pepper, long pepper, and flavorful spice blends and pastes, fermented hot sauces. And finally, on the topic of flavor, it's often said that there are 5: sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami. But look out on the horizon for kokumi, which for some is hailing the next umami or the sixth sensation. Although it's not yet widely accepted or defined, researchers are describing kokumi as that savory sensation rather than a taste per se, which imparts richness, roundness, and complexity. So this is all about getting interactive with our food again, the elevated sensory experience that comes with eating with our hands, eating street foods, dipping foods such as barilla, French dip, flatbreads. This is all about interaction and getting closer to our foods once more. As a consumer product, the Guinness flavour bomb on the right-hand side of the screen is a great example, accentuating flavour depth, almost being that secret ingredient. We also see a greater use of sour foods, flavours and components on plate, and many more applications of pickled and fermented foods. And Sam Ashton-Booth will be speaking more about this later on in the summit. And lastly, I'd like to talk about novel nostalgia that sits as part of the mega trend Take Me Away and is underpinned by the social driver Blissful Escape. One of the ways that we as humans cope with trauma and stress is with the fantasy coping mechanism, whether that's the pandemic, social change, or financial insecurity. Ultimately, pressure of this nature invites escape through blissful and imaginative escape, which is often satisfied through food and drink experiences. Unlike sensory exploration, the previous trend, memories activate that reward pathway in the brain, which is essentially a release of chemicals that make us feel good. This is a catalyst for us to repeat that act to feel good again, in this case, recalling happy memories. In a nutshell, this is why reliving fond experiences you've had makes you feel good. What's more, it's an inclusive feeling available to all. Feelings of nostalgia aren't restricted to a certain age group, but are common feelings to everyone. Novel nostalgia, in this context, is made up of nostalgia that is either lived or borrowed, perhaps digitally, and a rediscovery of that inner child. This is all about being transported to a place, a memory, an era, or with people that offer a sense of respite, safety, and sanctuary, but with a gourmet elevation or grown-up makeover. Perhaps more of a nostalgia rather than a nostalgia of food, but also music, fashion, and TV as well. So how will it manifest? First up, this is not new, but it has a new relevance in 22-23. It's all about gastro-elevated nostalgia, taking classics to new heights. We see specific eras and generational relevance that is core in this space. The 20s with a new wave of speakeasies, but also 70s and 90s. We also see certain places and geographies trend here, such as tropical and American. Think southern, think road trip campfires, slushies, s'mores, corn dogs, deep pan pizza. The flavors of childhood treats, snacks, family food and holiday. The smogie is a great example of this on the bottom right-hand side. It's sweet, but also savory. It's dessert, but also dinner. It evokes the rolling hills of Tuscany, but also the Boy Scout movement in America. It inspires nostalgia, but also embraces that sort of forward motion. In this case, it's a graham cracker-infused hoagie roll stuffed with toasted marshmallow, dark chocolate sea salt spread, but also with crispy prosciutto and topped with a brown sugar glaze. Also, the hot dog rounds on the top right-hand side of the screen are also a great example of this. Also in this space, ice cream floats, ice cream sandwiches, more kid and adult formats. Also frozen 2.0 from a beverage point of view. Cocktails, slushes, where frosé once ruled, it's now about Friesling, Frosgelé, sangria slushes, and frozen Aperol spritz. That wraps up the introduction to the TFP Top 10 and Rising for 22-23. But as a taster of 11 to 20 of the top 20 from the Foresight framework, we also expect to see more from simple suppers inspired by TikTok that combine affordability, speed, and also some involvement as well. More links between the gut and other body axes, such as the skin and lungs, more ingestible beauty, and food and drink existing increasingly in a virtual context. The meeting of old and new agricultural practices for climate impact. Farshad Kazemian will be speaking more about this later on. Plant-based fine dining, the increased use of upcycled byproduct in food and drink, more closed-loop cooking, more culinary influence from regional Mexico, and increased value of hospitality and food and drink workers with a greater focus on pay and conditions. So everyone who is participating today will be able to access the Top 10 Trends video and the supporting downloadable infographic that goes with that, as well as the links to all of today's presentation replays at the end of today's live broadcast. If you're a subscriber to Trend Hub, get onto the platform, explore the full Foresight framework, the digital trends book, and all of the supporting videos that bring each of the trend manifestations to life. In the meantime, thanks for listening to the Top 10 for 22-23.